the reason that black people are in the streets has to do with the lives they're forced to lead in this country. And they're forced to lead these lives by the indifference and the apathy and a certain kind of ignorance, a very willful ignorance on the part of their co-citizens. But in fact, I'm a man like you. I want to live like you. This country is mine too. I paid as much for it as you.
I've been torn about how to go about this video because I don't want to speak over the voices of people of color, and I don't want to like insert my voice into a conversation that I'm really not like the most qualified person at all, you know, to be speaking on. So I feel like as a white person it's really my job to just listen and to support the Black Lives Matter movement as much as I can. So what I want to do in this video, I think, is not to explain or echo anyone else's points, but instead to tell you about some of the anti-racist books, videos, podcasts, and other resources that have sort of changed and shaped the way that I am educating myself. I think I'm going to try to address 4 different things that you might be thinking, or that people you know might be saying or thinking. That's great, but I'm not racist. I'd be furious if I lived in America, but racism isn't that bad here, whether it's Ireland, UK, or Europe. I support their movement, but I think it should be peaceful. And I'd like to help if there's something I can do. So I'll put the timestamps in the description so you can skip to whichever one you're most interested in, but I would recommend you watch the whole thing. Part 1. That's all great, but I'm not racist.
Is there a way that you can sort of explain white supremacy for people who aren't sure if they understand the concept?
Yeah, I think for most people, their understanding of white supremacy is that it belongs to a very small group of fringe individuals who are intentionally, purposefully hateful towards people of color. And so it doesn't really apply to anyone else. It's not about whether you're actually choosing it or not. White supremacy is a system, it's an institution, it's a paradigm, and it's based on this idea that people who are white or who look white are superior to people of other races, and that has consequences.
There's been a conversation for a very long time that racism is systemic, and we're all part of the system of white supremacy, and therefore we're all somewhat accountable. And it's not so much about being like an overtly bigoted person, but it's about deconstructing a lot of what society has instilled in you. And I feel like we've all probably seen that around the internet, but I think it's important to go deeper with that and look into it more. Something that really like highlighted this and made it very real for me and really fully drummed into my head, so to the extent that it really changed the way I think and perceive the world, is this book called The Me and White Supremacy Workbook by Layla Saad.
Me and White Supremacy is not a book that you read. First of all, I'll say that. It's a book that you do. It's based on an Instagram challenge that I created and ran in the summer of 2018. And it's a 28-day journey for people who have white privilege to examine themselves, to better understand their white privilege, to better understand their complicity in white supremacy, and really understand their unconscious racist thoughts and beliefs.
You can get it in audiobook form, or there's, I think, like a PDF of it you can download online, which I'll link in the description. Everything I mentioned is going to be linked in the description, and I really feel like it should be required reading just for being alive, living in any kind of Western society. Another book that covers the same topic is White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo.
The title of your book is White Fragility, and the subtitle is Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism.
Most people of color will agree that the hardest thing about speaking to white people about race is that we are so defensive. Most white people, if we really look into it, are more defensive and more concerned about being perceived as racist than we are about actual racism. And what is it about society that reinforces this idea that like we have a right not to be called out on our privilege or our prejudice, and that protects us from growing or changing, because we're so wrapped up in this idea that like a racist is a very specific thing. It's like a man from like the southern states of the United States who's hurling racist abuse at like a black person. Whereas in fact racism is so much more complicated. Racism is so tied up in capitalism, it's so tied up in imperialism and like states and like the prison industrial complex and all these things that we all participate in constantly. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the concept of hegemony, but there is, I mean, possibly the strongest hegemony in our society is the white hegemony, which means that basically you're assumed, like every person and every person's experience is assumed to be white, and that's the norm. And then if you're outside of the norm, you're the other. There's a great interview online, Toni Morrison speaking about how people always ask her, okay, you write race books, but when are you going to write about a white person? Because in their minds, because she was writing about people of color, she was writing a niche experience.
You know, Tolstoy writes about race.
Yeah.
all the time. So does Zola, so does James Joyce. Now, if anybody can go up to an imaginary James Joyce and say, you write about race all the time. It's central in your novels. When are you going to write about what? Because you see, the person who asks that question doesn't understand that he or she is also raced. So to ask me when am I going to stop, or when, if I can, is to ask a question that, in a sense, is its own answer. Yes, I can write about white people. Having to do it or having to prove that I can do it is what was embarrassing or insulting. The question was posed as though it were a desirable thing to do, to write about white people or to write not about race. That's what that means to me. And that it was a difficult thing to do, a higher level of artistic endeavor, or it was more important, and that I was still writing about marginal people, and why don't I come into the mainstream?
Aren't you importing too much into the question?
Maybe.
I think so.
But what else could it be, Charlie?
I think even very progressive people who are consider themselves very anti-racist still view people of color as other, because I think if you are raised watching TV shows and reading children's books just about white people, and all your teachers are white and your family are white and your dolls are white and everything, you're going to associate whiteness with like the norm, and that's really damaging. You can see how down the line it leads to all these much more obviously sinister issues. If all this makes you uncomfortable, I think that's like okay, and it should make you uncomfortable, but if your first instinct is to switch off, you really do have to remember that like people who are experiencing racism, people who are oppressed in the societies that they live in because of their race, can't just switch it off or like self-care or like forget about it. It is our job to sit in the discomfort and educate ourselves and really look at these things head on, especially if it's uncomfortable. Which leads me on to my next point. The idea that racism only exists in America, or this is an American problem.
Ireland is known everywhere for the way it opens its arms to tourists and visitors. 100,000 welcomes goes the traditional expression. But how to balance that with the experience of Lassane, who fled death threats in Burkina Faso to travel across the seas to Dublin. Life as a refugee here, he told me, is even worse than home.
I'm from Ireland, and we have this idea very ingrained in our society that we're not an inherently racist place because we're not like North America or Australia or whatever. Our land isn't stolen from someone else. In fact, historically, we were the people who were being colonized. So I think we have this idea that because our national identity is so bound up in our own like colonized suffering that we couldn't possibly be perpetuating any kind of like white supremacy on anyone else. And I think like using that language that we are very fluent in and trying to turn that into a way to empathize and a way to be better anti-racists as a nation is a good idea. But I think that just saying that because we have this history we can't possibly be racist is unbelievably naive and just wildly untrue. One of the things that we've been discussing a lot is direct provision, which is this really horrendous, inhumane policy we have in Ireland with regards to the processing and like status and treatment of asylum seekers and refugees.
What is direct provision? Direct provision is a system that was set up by the government in 1999-2000 to cater for asylum seekers as they come into the country, whilst they wait for the Department of Justice to make a decision about their stay in the state. That system was initially meant to take 6 months. After speaking to her, I asked her how long she's been in the system. She said 8 years. Imagine how that made me feel. Then I thought, well, a small room for me and my son, and a bathroom, not too bad. But he will grow up to be a teenager. I'll still be staying with him in that small room.
If in Burkina Faso I knew that coming here I will be kept for that so long, I will be forced to live in a system where I might go mental or lose my human sense, or my dignity will be affected, or I would feel less human. I don't see that I would deserve that.
In 2004 we had a referendum on citizenship and granting citizenship to children born in Ireland whose parents are not Irish citizens, and Ireland, the Irish population, voted something like 80% to limit citizenship to people who are born in Ireland who have Irish citizen parents. So after that vote, if you came here and had a baby, that baby was not an Irish citizen. It was fundamentally racist. More broadly speaking as well, the European Union has over the last few years become an enormous fortress. There is an enormous refugee crisis here that we don't talk about as much as we did maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and it's still horrendous. There's still people living in horrendous refugee camps all over Europe, and I think it's really telling that I see people talking about how Black Lives Matter protests are irresponsible with regards to COVID-19, and yet there's been no conversations about what it must be like to be living in a refugee camp or living on indirect provision during a virus pandemic, because these people have no ability really to, they have no control over what they eat, they have no control over what comes in and out of their homes, and they have no control over really being able to distance from anyone else or have any kind of space to isolate in, especially in a pandemic. We shouldn't be focusing on protesters who are there consensually. We should be focusing on the people who are being locked into small spaces because of like EU or Irish immigration policy, and who don't have the choice and who are just now in danger of this disease because of it. Kristen Leo has a really, really great video. She talks about why what's happening in the United States is relevant for Europeans.
Everyone globally benefits from a less violent America, from a less racist America, from a less patriarchal and white supremacist and fascist America. The United States has consistently, from the moment that it was stolen from Native Americans, been a very violent country, a very imperialist country that has created a lot of political instability globally. It's been a country that has funded literal terrorist groups that have caused havoc in Europe, that have created millions of war refugees. So this is not an issue that we should be taking lightly. I think this is a moment for all of us to start speaking out, for all of us to start supporting the Americans that are revolting against this very fascist government. And I also think that us on social media have a duty at this time to stand in solidarity, to speak up, and to also not colonize this movement, but to instead amplify Black voices.
Saying that the white supremacy in the United States is an isolated American issue is completely ridiculous. I mean, if you zoom out and think about how the world works, white supremacy in the United States is a huge contributing factor to their violence, to the violence that the United States puts out into the world, in particular to like non-white majority countries, which they periodically wage war on. And like, let's not forget that all the refugees in these refugee camps in Europe are refugees because in part of the things that Western countries have done in their home countries. So it's like it's very much racism is very much a global issue. I don't like the protests because they're violent / are destroying property.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them. On the other hand, because of the way this society is organized, because of the violence that exists on the surface everywhere, you have to expect that there are going to be such explosions. You have to expect things like that as reactions. If you are a Black person and live in the Black community all your life and walk out on the street every day seeing white policemen surrounding you, and when you live under a situation like that constantly, and then you ask me, you know, whether I approve of violence. I mean, that just doesn't make any sense at all.
The Black Lives Matter protests have been hugely mischaracterized in the media. There's so much footage of either protesters like burning stuff or like police being allies kneeling on the ground. This is a weird time when social media has been slightly more indicative. The videos that are being shared have been much more indicative of sort of the real atmosphere. With that being said, I do think that rioting and looting is perfectly reasonable at this point. The idea that you're disrupting the peace is predicated on this idea that society was like peaceful and safe before this started happening. I think this statement kind of shows that you might genuinely support the Black Lives Matter movement, but you maybe don't get how deep this goes, how much it affects our social structures, and why things like the police and military are fundamentally violent and oppressive themselves. So maybe this is a good moment to reflect and think I mean, who do you think feels safe in America or anywhere during peaceful times? Who does peace protect? Whose peace is valued in our societies? Netflix has uploaded the full documentary 13th on YouTube, so I'm going to link that below as well. On this topic, I would also really recommend The New Jim Crow and this video about prison abolition from this YouTuber called For Harriet. Across the board, For Harriet makes incredible videos about all sorts of topics, which I've been watching her for a very long time and I really couldn't recommend her more. She's also great on other social media platforms. I don't have an Instagram, but I've been told her Instagram is great. Talking a lot about how institutional racism is inseparable from capitalism and how we have to take like an intersectional approach to this and really think about the structures. Part 4. There's nothing we can do. There's a lot of resources at the moment about how to be a better anti-racist ally. Let's talk about a few things that we can do. We can donate to Black Lives Matter affiliated organisations. And if you can donate money, or if you have donated money but want to donate even more, there are these videos on YouTube that are going around. They're like about an hour long. And they're full of ads, and if you watch them the whole way through, the AdSense money from the videos all goes to Black Lives Matter. Just watch the whole thing through. You don't actually have to watch it. You can just like press play and then go off about your life. But the great thing is, yeah, the AdSense money from that is going to the movement. Signing petitions and sharing petitions is very important. I'm going to link a few petitions relating to direct provision in the description box, and also there is a link to a email that you can copy and paste and send to your local TD to talk about ending direct provision in Ireland. So that's going to be linked below as well. The next thing that you can do is actually do the work by reading the things mentioned and watching the videos. If every single well-meaning white person across Europe, North America, Australia, etc. did the work to completely change the way they saw things and to really just destroy the white hegemony in their minds and raise their children with that same perspective and change the way they went about their education, change the way they interact with media. I mean, that would be such a huge change in the world, and it would be so much harder for racism to keep going unchecked. So yeah, start with yourself. Do it silently and don't do it because you think it's improving you. Do it because people of colour deserve to be safe in this world, and because you are the world, and thus you can make it safer within yourself.
The catchphrase, what that was all about, the revolution will not be televised, that was about the fact that the first change that takes place is in your mind. You have to change your mind before you change the way you live and the way you move. So when we said that the revolution will not be televised, we were saying that the thing that's going to change people is something that no one will ever be able to capture on film. It'll just be something that you see, and all of a sudden you realize, I'm on the wrong page. Or I'm on the right page, but I'm on the wrong note. And I've got to get in sync with everyone else to understand what's happening in this country. But I think that the Black Americans have been the only real die-hard Americans here, because we're the only ones who've carried the process through the process. That everyone else has sort of skipped stages. We're the ones who marched, we're the ones who carried the Bible, we're the ones who carried the flag, we're the ones who tried to go through the courts. And being born American didn't seem to matter, because we were born Americans, but we still had to fight for what we were looking for.
Another thing you can do is have uncomfortable conversations, and I really mean this. Having conversations, once you've done the work, having conversations with your friends, your family, people in your community. I don't know, people often say, how can I know this stuff if no one's ever told me? Or people think that it's the job of their Black friends or their friends of colour to educate them on racism. And the thing is, literally for so much of history, there's been activists and writers who were Black who were trying to tell us this stuff, and white people were not listening. So it's really not an issue of who's going to explain it to me or who's going to tell me. It's very much an issue of listening, just because the information is there. This is not a video saying I educated myself and you can too. This is a video where I'm saying that I'm committing to doing better, and I hope you will do that with me. Everything referenced in this video and the full versions of all the clips I've used are linked in the description. I've also made a playlist of YouTube videos on this topic. I'll put the playlist at the top of my channel so that you can just go there for more information. Please comment with any more resources or writings or ideas that everyone should be aware of and read on this issue. I assume many of you are way more educated than I am, so I'd really appreciate that. Also, if I've said anything in this video that was wrong or harmful or ignorant in any way, please call me out. I'm not sensitive about it. I don't think the call out culture is necessarily negative, especially in this situation. Let's educate each other and hold each other accountable and make a safer and more compassionate world for everyone. Wherever you are in the world and whatever you're doing, please stay safe. Love you guys. Bye.